old Joe was dying, and realizing that his time was running out, he wanted to make everything right. But something was bothering him. He was at odds with Bill, formerly one of his best friends. Joe had often argued with Bill over the most trivial matters, and in recent years they hadn't spoken at all. Wanting to resolve the problem, he sent for Bill, who graciously consented to visit him. And when Bill arrived, Joe told him that he was afraid to go into eternity with bad feelings between them, and he wanted to make things right. Then he reached out for Bill's hand and he said, "I forgive you. Will you forgive me?" Everything seemed fine. Just as Bill was leaving, however, Joe shouted after him, "But remember, if I get better, this doesn't count." The trouble with the passage from Matthew 18 for preaching is that it doesn't sound like Jesus, as Rick mentioned to the kids. It sounds more like the regulations of a church committee than like Jesus. And Matthew probably wrote from the context of a very close, if not monastic, church. He uses the word brother a lot, like monks would between themselves. And the emphasis is on order and discipline and rules. It doesn't sound like a traveling preacher speaking to his ragtag followers. It assumes a fully developed church organization. Now, church did not exist in Jesus' time. It was only after Pentecost that the church came into being. And it's possible that Jesus was projecting his teachings into the future, but it's more likely the church remembered his teachings and applied them to their situation. It seems to say that there comes a time when a person may be abandoned and beyond hope. Treat him like a pagan or tax collector, it says. Now, Jesus elsewhere ate with sinners, including tax collectors. So that's kind of curious. And Jesus elsewhere taught that we should forgive 70 times 7 times. But of course, that assumes a repentant brother or sister. The gospel message is that no one is totally beyond hope. Perhaps the teaching is not to shun the unrepentant sinner, but to focus even more intently on saving him or her, since Jesus' focus in ministry was to the sinners and tax collectors. Now, isolation can be one of the cruelest of punishments. Solitary confinement at all, when a prison inmate has committed a serious offense. Let me share a couple more stories to illustrate this. How strong the effects of isolated loneliness was graphically demonstrated by the French scientist Dr. Michel Siffre. As part of a scientific experiment, he remained alone in an underground room for 205 days. This was 100 feet below ground in Midnight Cave near Del Rio, Texas. He had all the food he needed, reading and recreational material, and a certain number of scientific tests to carry out each day. For the first third of the time, the scientists maintained good physical health and remained well adjusted, both mentally and physically. But after the second month, he began to feel almost suffocated by the loneliness. He started to show signs of physical, mental, and emotional deterioration. On the 86th day, he contemplated committing suicide. A week later, he was still hanging on, but wrote, "I am living through the nadir of my life. This long loneliness is beyond all bearing." We will do just about anything to make contact with another living being, especially another living human being, in order to establish a sharing community. This burning need to communicate with others is the way that God made us, so that through communication with others, we might reach some level of communion in love. We have been made by God out of his infinite love to give love and to receive it in return. And when this becomes impossible, we become dehumanized. And another story, in a little town in Central Europe, Jacob the tailor felt that he had been mistreated in the synagogue, and so he withdrew from the community and isolated himself from his friends and neighbors. Weeks went by until finally the rabbi called on him. After a polite greeting, there was a heavy silence. Then the rabbi said, "Let's go sit in front of the fire." So the two men sat in complete silence. An hour or so later, the rabbi picked up the fireplace tongs, pulled out a coal, and placed it on the hearth, away from the fire. Still, no word was spoken. The two men just sat and watched the glowing, burning piece of coal become darker and darker until finally it was black and cold and dusty with ashes. A few moments later, Jacob the tailor spoke. "I understand," he said. "I'll come back to the synagogue." Not a word had been spoken, but the point had been made. We withdraw from the community, we isolate ourselves from our neighbor, and we die. We need one another. Excluding someone from the community is one of the most harsh of punishments. You've heard the word excommunication, of cutting the line of communication. Paul suggests it in extreme cases of immorality. In 1 Corinthians 5:2, he says, "The man who has done such a thing should be expelled from your fellowship." Jesus, in the Gospel of Matthew, which we're just reading, teaches that an unrepentant believer who persists in not repenting should be treated as though a pagan or tax collector. Now, that doesn't mean to shun them, because Jesus never taught Christians to shun anyone. Rather, it means that they have chosen to exclude themselves from the community of faith by not abiding by the authority of the community. And protecting the nature of the community becomes very important. That's why Matthew reminds us to confront conflicts peacefully so that they can be resolved peacefully. You start by going directly to the one who has sinned against you or offended you. Only if that does not work do you draw others into the conflict, and even then, only one or two others. And finally, after the two prior steps, you include the entire fellowship to help resolve the conflict. Gossip and backstabbing are terribly destructive to the community. Whoever says he or she loves God and holds a grudge against a sister or a brother is a liar. Dividing a church into camps for and against an issue can damage that church for years to come. Now, that doesn't mean you don't confront controversial issues. It means you confront the issues and not each other. It means you respect the opinions of others and work out your differences with love. This church, the Fount, knows how to do that. Not all churches do. When someone has a difference of opinion in a meeting, we voice the differences and try to persuade others to see it our way. But when the vote is taken and the matter decided, all parties join hands and continue the journey together, united in love and respect. But the danger to resort to more selfish ways is always there, so we must always be on guard. We have to be diligent in refining and perfecting our ways together. In the summer of 1987, our son Joshua was born and died. There are few losses as painful as that of losing a child, and Cindy and I were beside ourselves in grief. But we were a part of a gathered community of Christ, and we did not have to bear the burden of pain alone. I can't imagine going through a loss like that without the church to uphold and support. We received such love and support from not only our local church, but also from the wider church and from colleagues in ministry, people we hardly even knew. And it's at times like that that the genius of God's purpose to gather us together is fully revealed. George Johnson has said, setting aside times to celebrate and pray is an investment in hope. Another story. Pastor Lazio Tokes, a 37-year-old pastor of the Hungarian Reformed Church of Romania, sparked a nationwide revolution. In December of 1989, while the rest of Eastern Europe was being freed from communist despots, Romania was still mired in despair. In an outspoken interview on Hungarian television, Tokes attacked his nation's treatment of the 1.7 million ethnic Hungarians who make up 8% of the Romanian population. The harassment was intense. Windows were broken in the church, there were phone threats, a denial of a ration book so that he was unable to buy bread, meat, or fuel. But he was part of a gathered people, and where two or three gather, the risen Christ is present with his power. Hundreds of supporters formed a human chain around Tokes' church building and apartment to protect him, and thus triggered the crackdown that helped inspire the nationwide demonstrations that toppled Nicolae Ceausescu, the final remaining communist dictator. It's more than just the multiplication of individual effort. Jesus' presence makes a marked difference. As we gather together in classes, life group meetings, fellowship groups, staff meetings, we should look for it and expect it, this presence of Jesus. Because God will guide his people through the gathered fellowship. Jesus will empower his people through the gathering of believers. Sometimes we will need to put aside our pride and certainly to listen to the word of the Lord, which comes at times through other believers. Sometimes we will need to admit our lack of power, our helplessness, so that we can be borne up by the power of the gathered church. But when we do that, power and wisdom will be there. Jesus has promised it to his people. The power in the gathered community, the church, is Jesus himself. For where two or three are come together in my name, I am there with them, says verse 20. That's not to say that Jesus is not with us when we are alone, but when we are together, there is no power on earth that can stop us. When we are together, there is no greater love expressed. When we are together, Jesus can and does work in and through us in ways that are so amazing that we can only stand in praise and adoration. We are the church of Jesus Christ. We are the people of God. Let us pause for a few moments of prayerful reflection as we consider what God may be saying to our hearts today.